The summer of 1947 in Mississippi was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and settled deep in the bones. The air smelled of magnolias and dust, the scent of something beautiful and something broken. Nathaniel Turner knew the land well. He had been born on it, raised on it, worked it until his hands were rough with calluses. He had watched his father bow under the weight of it, had seen his mother's eyes hollow with the quiet pain of a woman who understood what it meant to survive but never truly live. But Nathaniel was different. He carried his father's strength and his mother's sorrow, but inside him burned something else, something dangerous, a desire to be more than what this place allowed him to be. He had never spoken of that fire aloud, never dared to give it a name, until the day he met her. Elizabeth Hale. She was everything he was never meant to have. The daughter of Charles Hale, the wealthiest landowner in the county, the kind of man whose handshake could decide the fate of a town. She moved through life with an effortless grace, untouched by the weight of the world that bore down on men like Nathaniel. And yet, when she looked at him, it was as if she saw something no one else had ever bothered to see. It had started small, a glance across the town square, a fleeting moment in the general store, when their hands brushed reaching for the same jar of preserves. But it grew, like an ember catching on dry wood, until there was no stopping it. Their meetings were stolen moments in the shadows, whispers in the dark when the world was asleep. They met by the river, where the cypress trees stretched their gnarled roots into the water, ancient and unyielding. There, under the cloak of night, they could pretend that the world did not draw lines between them, pretend that love was enough to silence the voices of history. But the world did not pretend. The world did not forget. And neither did the men who had been raised to believe that love had rules, rules that must not be broken. The first warning came in the form of silence, the kind that followed Nathaniel wherever he went. The way the butcher stopped speaking to him, the way the preacher's sermons took on a sharper edge. Then came the whispers, the lingering stares, the way Elizabeth's father watched her too closely, as if he could smell the truth on her skin. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. And suspicion was a dangerous thing in a town like this. Nathaniel told her they had to stop. He told her this was a dream that would end in blood. But Elizabeth had never been one to walk away from a fight. "I don't care what they say," she whispered one night, her fingers lacing through his, gripping him as if she could hold on to him forever. "I love you, Nathaniel." And oh, how he wanted to believe that love could be enough. But the truth was written in the bones of this town, in the stories of men who had dared to reach beyond the chains wrapped around their throats. They had been warned. But love makes fools of even the wisest hearts. The night it happened, the air was thick with the coming storm. Nathaniel had heard the dogs first, the low, guttural growl that sent ice through his veins. Then the voices, angry and sharp, cutting through the trees like a blade. He ran. He ran because he knew how this story ended, because he had seen the nooses hanging like specters from the old oak tree at the edge of town. But he did not run fast enough. The first blow knocked him to the ground, the taste of iron filling his mouth. Boots slammed against his ribs, fists rained down, voices spit words soaked in venom. "You think you can touch what ain't yours?" He barely heard them over the roaring in his ears, over the sound of Elizabeth screaming his name. She fought them, clawed at them, begged them, but they were deaf to her cries. And then silence. A gunshot. The world stilled. When Nathaniel opened his eyes, he saw her. Blood blooming across the front of her pale dress, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She fell to her knees beside him, her fingers pressing against his cheek, smearing warmth across his skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I tried to stop them." He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault. He wanted to tell her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. But the words stuck in his throat, swallowed by the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. He heard her father's voice, raw with something that almost sounded like grief. You should have known better, girl. And then, nothing. When Nathaniel woke, the world had changed. Elizabeth was gone. Her father had buried her in the family plot, a quiet funeral, no mention of why she had been killed. Nathaniel had survived, but he was not the same. He carried the weight of her love like a ghost, a wound that would never close. He left Mississippi that night, carrying nothing but the memory of her touch and the truth that had cost them everything. Years later, when the world had changed, when the signs came down and the laws shifted, he returned. He stood before her grave, an old man now, the fire inside him long dimmed but never fully extinguished. And that was when he learned the truth. A woman, old and frail, with eyes that had seen too much, found him there. She was pregnant, you know. The words hit him like a hammer to the chest. Her father found out. That's why it happened the way it did. Nathaniel sank to his knees, his hands pressing into the damp earth above her. A child. Their child. A life that had been stolen before it had even begun. He did not cry. He had no tears left to give. But as he sat there, beneath the fading Mississippi sun, he realized something. They had tried to erase him. Tried to erase them. But love, real love, it does not die so easily. And neither did the truth. Nathaniel sat before her grave as the revelation settled into the marrow of his bones, a grief too vast to name tightening around his throat. The child he never knew, the life stolen before it could even take its first breath, buried beneath layers of silence and shame. He imagined what might have been, a boy with Elizabeth's storm-blue eyes, a girl with his mother's defiant spirit, a child born of a love that had never been meant to exist in this world. The weight of it crushed him, years of suffering folding in on themselves until all that remained was an unbearable stillness. He traced Elizabeth's name on the gravestone with trembling fingers, whispering to the earth as though she could still hear him, as though she could feel the ache that had lived inside him all these years. I would have fought for you, he murmured, his voice hoarse, worn with time. For both of you. The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment he swore he could hear her voice in the rustling leaves, feel the warmth of her hand against his own. But ghosts did not return, and neither did the past. He stayed there as the day faded, as the Mississippi sky burned gold and violet before slipping into the blackness of night, the cicadas singing a mournful song in the distance. He had spent a lifetime running, from the memories, from the pain, from the truth of what had been taken from him. But there was nowhere left to run now. He had outlived them all. The men who had beaten him, the town that had tried to erase him, the father who had condemned his own daughter to silence. He had survived, but for what? To carry the weight of a love that had been torn from him, to learn too late of the child who had never been given a chance to live. The injustice of it burned through him, but there was no one left to blame, no vengeance left to take. Only the quiet, only the memory, only the endless questions of what could have been. He closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he felt like he had been holding for decades, and when he opened them again, he knew what he had to do. He could not change the past, could not bring back Elizabeth or the child they had lost, but he could speak their names. He could refuse to let them disappear into the silence that had been forced upon them. The world had changed, slowly, painfully, but it had changed. He could tell the truth now, and perhaps, in doing so, he could finally lay their ghosts to rest. The road back to town was long, the weight of years pressing heavy against his bones. But Nathaniel walked it anyway, his heart beating with something that felt almost like purpose. He would find someone who would listen, someone who would remember, someone who would make sure their story was never forgotten. Because love like theirs did not fade. It lived in the blood, in the bones, in the whispers of history that refused to be silenced. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Nathaniel walked through the quiet streets of the town he once called home, the weight of history pressing down on him with every step. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the remnants of an afternoon rain lingering in the cracks of the cobblestone roads. He had sworn never to return, yet here he was, his feet carrying him toward the one place where the truth could still be spoken. The town had changed on the surface, new storefronts, paved roads, an air of progress whispering through the spaces where old wounds had been buried. But the past had a way of lingering beneath fresh coats of paint. He could still feel the eyes of ghosts watching him from the porches, still hear the echo of hushed voices warning against the danger of a black man who did not know his place. But he had stopped fearing ghosts a long time ago. He found himself standing in front of the town's small newspaper office, the same one that had once printed headlines about race riots and arrests without ever daring to name the real crimes committed in the night. The same office that had once refused to print the truth of Elizabeth's death. But time had turned the hands that held the pen, and now a woman sat behind the desk, her skin the color of warm earth, her hair coiled in thick braids beneath a simple scarf. She looked up at him, eyes sharp and questioning, and in that moment, he knew she understood why he had come. Without a word, she gestured to the chair across from her, setting down her pen, waiting. He had spent years carrying the burden of silence, but now, at last, he spoke. He told her everything, the way Elizabeth had looked at him that first time in the general store, the way their love had bloomed in the quiet spaces the world could not touch, the way fear had chased them through the trees on that terrible night. He told her about the child, the life that had been stolen, the truth buried beneath decades of secrecy and shame. His voice did not shake, not once. He had lived this pain too long to let it break him now. The woman listened, her hands still, her breath slow and steady as if absorbing the weight of the story, as if hearing the echoes of all the lives lost in its telling. When he finished, there was only silence, thick and unyielding, stretching between them like an unspoken promise. Then she picked up her pen. "This time," she said softly, "we print the truth." And so, for the first time, the town would know. Not the whispers, not the rumors, not the lies told to protect the men who had stolen a daughter, a lover, a father. The truth would be written in ink, undeniable, unerasable. Nathaniel exhaled, a breath that felt like it had been held for half a century, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. He stood, his body weary, but his spirit lighter, and walked back toward the graveyard where Elizabeth rested beneath the weeping branches of an old oak tree. He sat beside her once more, pressing a hand to the earth that held her, and whispered, "They'll know you now. They'll know about our love. They'll know about our child. They'll know what they did." The wind stirred the branches above, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could hear her laughter, soft and distant, carried on the breeze. Nathaniel closed his eyes, letting the sound settle deep within him, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that some love stories did not end in silence. Some love stories refused to be forgotten. The days that followed felt like standing on the edge of a storm, the air thick with something electric, something inevitable. Nathaniel stayed in town longer than he intended, longer than he should have. But he could not leave now, not when the truth was finally uncoiling itself from the shadows. The article ran in the town's newspaper 3 days later, bold and unapologetic, every word a wound torn open, every sentence a reckoning. It named names. It told the truth about what had happened to Elizabeth, about the child that had been erased from history, about the men who had stolen what they had no right to take. Nathaniel sat on the front steps of the boarding house as the town woke up to the truth, as newspapers were unfolded over breakfast tables and passed between hands that once pretended they had not seen what they had seen. He watched as men stopped mid-stride in the streets, as women pressed their hands to their mouths, as the weight of buried sin settled over them like dust. Some, he knew, would turn away, would scoff, would call it a lie, because the past had always been easier to ignore than to face. But others would remember. Others would whisper the story to their children, and their children's children, until silence was no longer an option. But silence, he knew, had never been the enemy. Fear was. And fear still lurked in the corners of this town, in the way some doors closed when he walked by, in the way certain men, old now, but not softened by time, watched him from beneath the brims of their hats, their faces lined with something uglier than age. It was on the fourth night that the warning came. A rock through the window of the boarding house, shattering glass and settling in the dust like a dead thing. No note, no words, just the violence of it, the message scrawled in the silence it left behind. Nathaniel did not flinch, did not move, just stared at the broken pieces glittering in the moonlight. He had expected this. He had known the truth would not come without consequence. But he was not afraid. He was too old for fear. The next morning, he walked through the town like a man who had nothing left to lose, shoulders squared, back straight, letting them see him, letting them know he was still here, that he would not be erased the way they had erased Elizabeth. He returned to the graveyard that evening, the sky bruised with the fading sun, and sat by Elizabeth's headstone, letting the quiet settle around him. "They're scared," he murmured, fingers tracing the curve of her name, carved into stone. "Scared of what the truth will change." He let out a slow breath, closing his eyes, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him, and for the first time in decades, he let himself remember the way she used to look at him, the way she used to laugh, the way she used to press her hand to his chest and whisper, "You're stronger than they know." He stayed there until the stars came out, until the air turned cool against his skin, until he could almost believe she was sitting beside him, her fingers laced through his. And when he finally rose to his feet, when he turned back toward the town, he knew that no matter what came next, no matter the threats, no matter the consequences, the truth had already taken root. And there was no stopping it now. The night felt heavier than usual as Nathaniel walked back toward the boarding house, the air thick with something unspoken, something waiting. He knew what would come next. Men like the ones who had taken Elizabeth, men who had built their lives on silence and fear, did not let the past resurface without trying to bury it again. He had seen it before. He had lived it. But he had not come this far to run. When he reached his room, the scent of dust and old wood pressing in around him, he found a note slipped under the door. The handwriting was rough, hurried, the words scrawled in a way that carried urgency rather than threat. Asterisk, meet me by the old mill. Midnight. It's about Elizabeth. Asterisk, no name. No signature. Just the weight of what it implied. He stared at it for a long time, the memories curling like smoke in his mind, the ghost of Elizabeth's voice whispering through the years. He should not go. He knew this. It could be a trap, a final warning, a chance to make him disappear the way they had made her disappear. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had carried a secret all these years, waiting for the right moment to speak? What if, after all this time, there was still more of Elizabeth's story to be told? The hours dragged, thick with tension, until the town was swallowed in darkness, the streets emptied, the world hushed in the stillness before something breaks. Nathaniel slipped from the boarding house unseen, the note folded in his palm, his steps quiet against the road as he made his way to the outskirts of town. The mill stood as it always had, its wooden frame weathered by years of storms and neglect, its windows like hollowed-out eyes staring into the night. A place of the past. A place where secrets could still live. He waited. The wind stirred the tall grass, the cicadas humming in the distance, the weight of history pressing against his ribs. Then, a shadow moving at the edge of the trees. A figure stepping forward, hesitant but certain. And then he saw her. Ruth, Elizabeth's younger sister. He hadn't seen her since before the night everything had changed, since she was a girl with wide eyes and too many questions, the kind of questions that got people hurt. Now she was a woman, her face carved with time, her gaze heavy with something unsaid. "I should have told you," she said, her voice low, cracking beneath the weight of years. "I should have come sooner." Nathaniel's pulse drummed in his ears, his breath sharp with something between hope and dread. "Told me what?" She swallowed hard, looking past him, looking at something only she could see. "Elizabeth didn't die that night." The words hit him like a blow, like the wind had been knocked from his lungs, like the ground beneath him had disappeared. "What?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, disbelief thick in his throat. Ruth took a shaky breath. "They took her, beat her, left her for dead. But someone found her. Someone got her out." Nathaniel shook his head, the world tilting, unraveling. No, I was there. I saw her body. You saw what they wanted you to see." Ruth cut in, her voice sharper now, trembling. "They wanted you to believe she was gone. But she wasn't." The silence stretched, too vast, too unbearable. Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides, his heart hammering so hard it ached. "Where is she?" Ruth's gaze dropped, something breaking in her expression. "Gone now. For real this time." A breath, shallow and ragged, escaped him, and the pain that followed was something he could not name, something too large for words. "She lived?" His voice cracked on the word, the weight of it unbearable. "She lived," Ruth said softly. "But she couldn't come back. They would have killed her for real. She hesitated, as if afraid to say the next words, as if she knew they would destroy him. "She had your baby, Nathaniel." The world stopped. Everything, all of it, ceased to exist in the space between her words and his breath. His chest felt hollow, his mind unable to grasp what she had just said. "No," he murmured, shaking his head, his voice barely there. "No, that's not a boy," Ruth continued, her voice thick with sorrow, with regret. "She named him Samuel. He was real. He was yours." Nathaniel staggered back, the weight of it crashing over him. Years of grief, of loss, of believing there was nothing left, unraveling in an instant. He had a son. He had a son. And he never knew. "Where is he?" His voice was desperate now, rough, unsteady. Ruth's face twisted, pain and guilt etched deep in her features. She looked away. "He died young. Fever took him before he was 10. The words carved through him, sharp as a blade, stealing the air from his lungs, the strength from his bones. He swayed where he stood, his breath coming in short, broken gasps, the world spinning beneath him. A son who had lived. A son who had died. A son he had never held, never known, never had the chance to love. "I'm so sorry," Ruth whispered, and there was real grief in her voice, real sorrow. But it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. He turned away, pressing a hand to his chest as if that could hold in the shattering pieces of his heart. The stars above blurred, the night closing in around him, the weight of lost time too much to bear. Elizabeth had lived. Their child had lived. And he had been here, believing there was nothing left. He closed his eyes, breathing in the night, and when he opened them again, something inside him had shifted. He could not change the past. He could not reclaim what had been stolen from him. But he could make sure they were remembered. He could make sure their story was never erased again. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window of his small room at the boarding house, staring out at the town that had taken everything from him, from Elizabeth, from their child. The lamplight flickered against the glass, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the wooden floor. His hands shook as he held the old newspaper in his lap, the article that had torn open the past now stained with the sweat of his trembling fingers. Elizabeth had lived. His son had lived. And they had both died without him. He thought of the years he had spent grieving her, believing she was buried beneath the soil of this town, believing that night had stolen everything. But the truth was crueler than any nightmare. She had been alive, alone, carrying their child in a world that would not accept him, in a world that would rather see him erased than acknowledged. And now he would never see them. never hear their voices, never hold his son's hand. The grief was suffocating, a crushing weight on his chest, but beneath it, something else simmered, something sharper, something like rage. The men who had done this had lived full lives. They had walked these streets with their heads held high, had sat in the same church pews on Sundays, had raised families of their own while Nathaniel's family had been torn from him. He clenched his fists, his breast shaking as he forced himself to his feet. He could not let it in like this. He would not. By the time dawn broke, he had made his decision. The town was stirring when he stepped onto the street, his face set in stone, his body moving with purpose. People glanced at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. They had read the article. They knew what it meant. And now, they would know what came next. He walked straight to the sheriff's office, past the men lingering outside, past the whispers that followed him, and pushed through the door. The sheriff, old now, white hair thinning, the weight of his years visible in the lines of his face, looked up from his desk, his jaw tightening when he saw Nathaniel. "What do you want?" the sheriff asked, his voice as tired as his eyes. Nathaniel stepped forward, his hands steady at his sides. "I want justice." The sheriff exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Justice," he repeated, shaking his head. "Nathaniel, you know as well as I do, don't." Nathaniel cut him off, his voice low and sharp. "Don't tell me nothing can be done. You have their names. You've always had their names. They took her. They took our child. And this town let them." The sheriff looked away, his jaw tightening. "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. "They're still here. They still walk free. And you've known it all this time." The silence between them was thick, unbearable. The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair, the weight of his own complicity pressing down on him. "Nathaniel," he said slowly, as if the words pained him, "even if I arrested them, you think a jury of their peers would convict them?" Nathaniel's throat burned, fury and despair twisting inside him. He had known the answer before he even stepped inside, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the quiet resignation in the sheriff's voice, made it real. The law would not help him. It never had. It never would. He turned without another word, pushing through the door and back into the blinding light of the morning. The town lay before him, unchanged, untouched by the truth he had fought to bring into the light. But something in him had changed. He would not leave this town in silence. He would not let Elizabeth and their son be forgotten. If justice would not come from the law, then it would come from the weight of history, from the people who could no longer look away, from the truth that refused to be buried. He went back to the newspaper office, the bell above the door jangling as he stepped inside. The young black woman who had printed his story looked up from behind her desk, her eyes sharp, knowing. "We're not done yet," he told her. And together, they began to write. More names. More stories. The secrets this town had buried for decades, dragged into the light for all to see. The next morning, new papers hit the streets. And this time, there would be no turning away. The town was no longer silent. The newspapers spread like wildfire, passed from hand to hand, whispered in hushed voices, shouted in angered ones. The names were there now, printed in black ink that could not be erased, the weight of truth pressing down on the people who had spent decades pretending not to know. Nathaniel walked through the streets, feeling the shift in the air, the tension thick enough to choke on. Eyes followed him, some filled with guilt, others with fear, and some with a deep, simmering hatred of men who saw their past sins unearthed for all to see. The men who had taken Elizabeth, who had stolen his son's life before it had even begun, had spent years living comfortably, believing time would bury their crimes. Now time had turned on them. He saw one of them in the distance, Henry Calloway, older now, slower, but still the same man who had led the mob that night, who had spat words of hate and swung his fists like justice was something he could carve with his own hands. He was standing outside the general store, speaking in a hushed, frantic voice to another man, their eyes flicking toward Nathaniel before darting away. They were afraid. Good. But fear was not enough. Fear would not bring Elizabeth back. Fear would not change what had been done. Nathaniel felt the anger rise in his chest, the need to do something, to strike, to make them feel what he had felt all these years. But something held him back. Elizabeth. Her voice in his memory, her hand in his before they were torn apart, the way she had always whispered, "We survive, Nathaniel. No matter what." He closed his eyes for just a moment, swallowing the rage, swallowing the pain, knowing it would consume him if he let it. This was not about revenge. This was about making sure their names, Elizabeth, Samuel, were never erased again. That night, the fire started. It roared to life in the darkness, bright against the sky, the flames licking at the wooden bones of the old church, the place where Elizabeth had once prayed for mercy she had never been given. Nathaniel woke to the smell of smoke, to the sound of distant shouting, to the undeniable truth. Someone wanted to silence him, to send a message. But it was too late for that. The town had already seen. The town already knew. And this time, it would not be so easy to forget. He stepped into the street, watching the fire burn, watching the past turn to ash. And yet, in the destruction, something new stirred. A reckoning. A choice. The final act was coming, and Nathaniel knew, one way or another, this story was about to end. The fire burned through the night, a pillar of smoke twisting into the dark sky, the heat crackling through the air as the town gathered in silence, watching their past consume itself in the flames. Nathaniel stood at the edge of it all, the light flickering across his face, the heat pressing against his skin, and in the chaos of it, he realized that there was no going back now. The sheriff stood nearby, his face pale in the firelight, his hands clenched at his sides, as though trying to hold onto something that was already slipping through his fingers. He didn't look at Nathaniel, but he didn't stop him either. The town had made its choice. The names in the newspaper had started something that could not be undone. Somewhere in the crowd, Henry Calloway watched too, his face drawn tight with something between rage and fear, and for a long moment, Nathaniel thought the man might step forward, might try to fight, might try to take back the power he had wielded so freely all those years ago. But Henry did nothing. He only turned, disappearing into the night like a man who knew his time had finally run out. Nathaniel should have felt victorious. He should have felt something more than this hollow ache in his chest. But as he stared into the fire, all he could think about was Elizabeth, her voice, her laughter, the way she had held his face between her hands like he was something precious, something worth holding on to. He thought of their son, of the boy he never knew, of the years that had been stolen, and the pain in his heart was sharper than anything he had ever felt. Justice had come, in its own way. Not through the law, not through violence, but through truth. And yet, it would never be enough. Nothing could ever be enough. The flames began to die down, the embers glowing like ghosts in the ashes, and as the crowd slowly faded into the night, Nathaniel remained, standing in the wreckage of it all, knowing that when the sun rose, he would have a choice to make. Stay and continue the fight, or leave and finally let go. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind, to the echoes of the past that would never fully fade. The weight of history pressed down on him, but somewhere in the distance, beyond the smoke, beyond the pain, he could almost hear Elizabeth's voice whispering to him. We survive, Nathaniel. No matter what. And as dawn broke over the town, painting the sky in soft, golden light, he made his decision.